Ever feel like you're speaking different languages? When you're talking politics with someone from another country, like you're both passionate about the same things, but somehow the words just don't quite line up.
Oh, absolutely. It's fascinating, isn't it? The way these political labels, left and right, they can feel so different depending on where you are in the world.
It's like what's considered radical in one place is totally normal somewhere else.
Right. What's mainstream in one country might be on the fringe in another.
So we're going on a deep dive today into how those political labels left and right, well, how they can basically flip-flop around the globe.
We're going to challenge some assumptions today
Yep.
about what those labels really mean.
Get ready for some political surprises because we're looking at policies that might be considered, say, left-wing in one country, but then they take on a whole right-wing vibe somewhere else.
Exactly. It's all about context, history, culture. A policy that's seen as progressive in one place might be totally traditional somewhere else.
Okay, so let's dive right in.
Well, less.
Let's start with the big one, nationalism.
Nationalism often gets a bad rap, doesn't it? Seen as this inherently right-wing thing. But it's not that simple.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this left-wing nationalism.
Well, look at China, for example. The Communist Party there, they use nationalism to strengthen their grip on power.
So even though they're communists, they're using this idea of national unity, of being Chinese.
Exactly. They emphasize resisting foreign influence. And rallying around this idea of a strong, unified China, it's central to their ideology.
So it's like nationalism is a tool for them to maintain control.
Right. It helps legitimize their rule and bolster their socialist agenda.
Interesting. So how does that compare to nationalism on the right then?
Well, on the right, it tends to be more about preserving a certain cultural identity, less about a political system and more about tradition, heritage, even ethnicity sometimes.
I see. So more about protecting a specific way of life.
Exactly. Think of groups like, say, France's National Rally. They use nationalism to advocate for stricter immigration policies, protecting French culture and identity. Or Italy's Lega Nord, very focused on Italian sovereignty and pushing back against the influence of the European Union.
So it's like two sides of the same coin. On the left, nationalism as a way to solidify power. On the right, as a way to protect a particular cultural vision.
And in both cases, it can be a very powerful force, mobilizing people,
Yeah,
shaping policy.
absolutely. It's amazing how the same concept can be used in such different ways. It really highlights how fluid these political labels can be.
And that fluidity extends to other policies too. Let's take protectionism, for example. It can be a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing.
Protectionism, I always think of that as, buy American, that kind of thing. Supporting local businesses.
Right. Essentially, it's about shielding domestic industries and jobs from global competition, and it can be used in very different ways.
Okay, walk me through this. How does protectionism play out on the left?
Well, think of India. Leftist parties there, like the Communist Party of India, they see protectionism as a way to protect their workers from the negative impacts of globalization.
Protecting them from what? Outsourcing? Lower wages?
Exactly. They want to promote self-reliance, safeguard domestic jobs. They see global capitalism as a threat.
Makes sense. So how does that compare to the right-wing take on protectionism?
On the right, it often gets tied up with nationalist sentiment, putting your country's economic interests first, even if it means things like tariffs or trade wars.
Like America first under Trump, putting American jobs first.
Exactly. It resonated with a lot of people. It tapped into this idea of national strength, of economic dominance.
So protectionism can be about social welfare on the left
Yeah.
and national strength on the right.
Exactly. It's a great example of how the same policy can be framed in totally different ways depending on the political context.
Mind-blowing. All right, let's tackle another big one. Government intervention in the economy.
Ooh, that's a hot button issue for sure. People have strong feelings about that one.
It's like, how much should the government be involved in the economy?
Right, exactly. And you'd think it would be a simple left-right split, but it's not.
Okay, you've got my attention. Give me an example. How does this play out differently?
Well, let's look at Argentina. The Peronist movement there, they have a long tradition of government intervention. They've nationalized industries, controlled prices, provided subsidies.
Wow, so they're really hands-on. shaping the economy, protecting jobs.
Right. It's about using state power to create a more just economic system
Yeah,
to protect people from the perceived harshness of the free market.
I see. So how does that differ from the right-wing perspective? Because I imagine they're all about free markets, right?
Well, not necessarily. For many right-leaning governments, government intervention is seen as a way to promote economic growth and stability.
Wait, so they're not totally against government intervention?
Not at all. They might not want the same level of control as the left, but they see a role for the government in fostering a favorable business environment.
Okay, give me an example. What kind of intervention are we talking about here?
Well, think of Japan. The Liberal Democratic Party, which has been in power for a long time, they've used government intervention to guide economic development. They've implemented things like fiscal stimulus packages, subsidies for key industries.
So they're using the government to steer the economy in a certain direction.
Exactly. To maintain competitiveness, to ensure growth.
Interesting. So it's not just about big government versus small government. It's about how different countries with different political philosophies see the role of the state in the economy.
Exactly. It's all about context and ideology. What works in one place might not work in another, and what's considered left in one country might be right in another.
This is really making me rethink how I view the political spectrum. It's not as simple as I thought.
It's a lot more nuanced and complex, and we're just scratching the surface here.
I can't wait to dig deeper. What else is on the agenda for today's deep dive?
Well, next let's talk about secularism, because that can be a surprisingly fluid concept too.
Secularism. You mean separating church and state. That seems pretty firmly rooted in left-wing ideals.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it's not always that clear-cut. Secularism can take on different forms depending on where you are in the world.
Okay, I'm ready for another curveball. Tell me how secularism plays out in unexpected ways.
Well, consider Turkey. The Republican People's Party, they're staunchly secular. They want a strict separation of religion and state, particularly in education and law.
So in Turkey, secularism is a core left-wing principle.
Very much so. It's tied to the legacy of Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, and his vision of a secular republic.
I see. So where does the right come into play with secularism?
Well, in some European countries, right-wing parties have adopted secularist rhetoric, but their emphasis is different.
How so?
They're often not as focused on neutrality between religions. They tend to frame secularism as a way to protect national identity and traditional values, specifically from what they perceive as the threat of religious extremism.
So it's less about separating church and state, and more about controlling the influence of certain religions.
You could say that. Take France, for example. They have this concept of laïcité, which often gets translated as secularism. But right-wing parties there have used it to justify policies that restrict religious expression in public spaces, often targeting Muslim communities.
So it's a very different kind of secularism than what we see in Turkey, more about controlling the visibility of certain religions within society.
Exactly. And it's not just France. We see similar trends in other European countries, where right-leaning parties push for stricter secular policies, often framing it as a way to preserve national cohesion and traditional values.
Wow, so even something like secularism, which seems so straightforward, turns out to be quite complex.
Absolutely. It all depends on the context. What's considered progressive in one place might be seen as conservative in another, and what's left in one country might be right somewhere else.
It's like the political spectrum is a swirling vortex, not a straight line.
I love that analogy. It really captures the fluidity and complexity of political ideologies. And believe me, we've only just begun to explore the twists and turns of this vortex.
This is incredible. I'm already hooked. What other political paradoxes are we going to uncover as we continue our journey?
Well, next we're going to delve into one of the most contentious issues of our time, immigration. And as you might expect, it's not as simple as it seems.
Immigration. Okay, I'm ready for more mind-blowing insights.
Great, then let's dive right back in. Welcome back to our deep dive, where we're exploring those policies, those ideas that can be left-wing in one country and right-wing in another.
It's like the political spectrum is playing a game of musical chairs.
Right. What's considered left or right is always in motion.
Before the break, we were talking about secularism and how it can be championed by both the left and the right, but with totally different motivations.
Absolutely. It's a great example of how a single concept can take on different meanings depending on the context. And speaking of complex issues, let's talk about immigration.
Ooh, immigration. That's a topic that can really get people fired up. Strong feelings on all sides.
And it's often seen as this classic left-right divide. with the left being pro-immigration and the right being more restrictive.
Right. But I bet it's not that simple, is it?
Not at all. In fact, let's start by challenging the idea that open borders are purely a left-wing position.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me an example.
Well, consider Denmark, often seen as this very progressive country. But in recent years, the Social Democrats there, a traditionally left-leaning party, they've adopted stricter immigration controls.
Wait, Denmark, the land of hidden social welfare. They're getting tough on immigration.
They are, and their reasoning is interesting. They argue that managing immigration is essential to protecting their welfare state and maintaining social cohesion.
So it's like they're saying, we want to help people, but we also need to protect our own system.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between compassion and practicality. And it shows that even left-leaning parties can be pragmatic when it comes to immigration.
So it's not just about ideology. It's about real-world concerns, like the strain on social services.
Exactly. And we see similar trends in other countries, too, where left-leaning parties are grappling with this tension between wanting to be welcoming and needing to manage immigration flows.
Makes you realize that there's a lot more nuance to this issue than we often hear in the political debates. Okay, so what about the right-wing stance on immigration? Is that more predictable?
Well, in many cases, yes. You see right-wing parties advocating for stricter border controls, tighter restrictions.
To protect national sovereignty.
Often, yes. And also to safeguard domestic jobs and preserve a certain cultural identity.
Right. Like in the UK, for example. The
Mhm.
Conservative Party has often taken a pretty hard line on immigration.
Exactly. And it's not just the UK. You see similar trends in many countries around the world, where right-leaning parties tap into anxieties about cultural change and economic competition.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how a single issue, like immigration, can evoke such different responses depending on one's political perspective.
It really highlights the diversity of thought within these broad categories of left and right. And speaking of diverse perspectives, let's shift gears and talk about something else that can be surprisingly fluid: environmental policy.
The environment. That seems like a pretty clear-cut left-wing issue, right? Saving the planet, fighting climate change, all that.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? And in many cases, you'd be right. You see left-leaning parties all over the world championing environmental protection, pushing for renewable energy, stricter regulations, all that good stuff.
Right, like the Green New Deal in the U.S., for example. That's a big one for progressive Democrats. But you're telling me there are some surprises on the right when it comes to environmental policy.
There are indeed. You might be surprised to learn that some right-leaning parties have also embraced environmental protection.
Really? Give me an example.
Take Germany, for instance. Their Christian Democratic Union, a center-right party, they've been strong supporters of the Energiewende, which is this ambitious plan to transition Germany to renewable energy.
Wait, hold on. Germany, the land of powerful cars and heavy industry. They're going green, and it's being led by a right-wing party.
They are, and it shows that environmentalism isn't just a left-wing issue anymore. It's becoming more mainstream.
So it's not just about hugging trees. It's about recognizing the economic and strategic importance of sustainability.
Exactly. It's about finding ways to reconcile environmental protection with economic growth. And that's an idea that resonates with some right-leaning parties, too.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where environmentalism and economic interests align.
Right. And we see similar trends in other countries, too, like New Zealand, for example. Their national party, a center-right party, they've emphasized sustainable land management and conservation.
Interesting. So it's not just about the environment in the abstract. It's about tailoring environmental policies to fit the specific needs and priorities of a particular country.
Exactly. And it shows that there's a spectrum of views on environmentalism, even within the right. Some parties are more proactive, some are more cautious, but it's an issue that's on the radar of many right-leaning governments these days.
Wow. So even something like environmental policy, which seems like it should be straightforward, turns out to be quite nuanced. It's all about context, isn't it?
Absolutely. What's considered left or right on any given issue can vary widely depending on where you are in the world. And what's considered radical in one place might be totally mainstream in another.
It's like we need a whole new map for the political landscape. Okay, what other policy areas are we going to explore today?
Well, next, let's delve into something that's often at the heart of political debates: the welfare state.
Ah, the welfare state. Providing a safety net for those in need. That's a classic left-wing issue, right?
Yeah.
Universal health care, affordable housing, all that.
It's certainly a core value for many left-leaning parties. You see this in France, for example, where there's strong support for expanding social programs, for reducing inequality, for ensuring a basic standard of living for everyone.
Right, like those big social safety nets that they have in a lot of European countries.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's more to the story, right? What's the right-wing take on the welfare state?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that support for the welfare state isn't limited to the left. In Germany, for example, the Christian Democratic Union, a center-right party, they're actually strong defenders of their social market economy.
Hold on. Germany's Conservative Party is pro-welfare state. That doesn't seem to fit the stereotype.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it's about finding a balance. They believe in the power of free markets, but they also recognize the importance of social justice and stability. For them, a strong welfare state is essential for ensuring fairness and preventing societal unrest.
So it's not just about letting the free market run wild. It's about creating a safety net to catch those who fall through the cracks.
Exactly. And this more nuanced approach to the welfare state can be found in other right-leaning parties around the world, too. It's a reminder that political ideologies are rarely as simple as they seem.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. Every time we think we have a handle on what left and right mean, we find examples that defy our expectations.
It's a good reminder that the world is a complex place, and that political labels can be misleading. Okay, ready to tackle another big one.
Bring it on. What's next?
Let's talk about privatization, because that's another policy area where the lines between left and right can get blurry.
Privatization. Selling off government-owned businesses and services to the private sector. That seems like a pretty classic right-wing idea. Smaller government, free markets, all that.
It's certainly a cornerstone of many right-leaning economic policies, but as we've seen time and time again, the political world is full of surprises.
Okay, you've got my attention. What's the twist here? Where are we seeing privatization pop up in unexpected places?
Believe it or not, China provides a fascinating example. The ruling Communist Party, despite their socialist ideology, they've been steadily pursuing privatization and market-oriented reforms since the late 1970s.
Wait a minute. Communist China embracing privatization? That seems like a total contradiction.
It might seem counterintuitive, but it speaks to their pragmatic approach to economic development. They've recognized that incorporating elements of capitalism can be a powerful tool for achieving growth, even while maintaining a socialist political system.
So it's like they're saying, hey, if it works, it works.
Exactly. It's about finding what works, regardless of ideology. And of course, there are plenty of examples of privatization being used in a more traditional right-wing context, too.
Right, like Margaret Thatcher's policies in the UK back in the 80s. Privatizing industries, shrinking the size of government.
Exactly. So we see that privatization can be embraced by both the left and the right, albeit for different reasons. On the left, it can be a tool for driving economic growth within a socialist framework. While on the right, it's often seen as a way to reduce the role of government and unleash the power of the free market.
It's amazing how a policy that seems so firmly rooted in one side of the political spectrum can find support in such unexpected places.
Yeah.
Okay, this is blowing my mind. What other political paradoxes do we have in store?
Well, let's talk about populism, a term that gets thrown around a lot these days, but often without a clear understanding of what it actually means.
Populism. Yeah, it seems like everyone's either calling themselves a populist or accusing their opponents of being populist.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean, and how does it play out on the left versus the right?
At its core, populism is about appealing to the concerns and frustrations of ordinary people who feel ignored or marginalized by the political elite. It often involves a charismatic leader who positions themselves as the voice of the people against a corrupt or out-of-touch establishment.
Okay, so it's about tapping into that sense of dissatisfaction with the status quo. I can see how that could be a powerful tool for politicians across the political spectrum. So give me some examples of how populism takes shape on the left.
Well, a great example is former President Evo Morales of Bolivia. He rallied indigenous and working-class support by challenging neoliberal economic policies, advocating for land reforms, nationalizing natural resources. His focus was on empowering marginalized groups and redistributing wealth.
So it's about using populist rhetoric to champion the needs of the underprivileged and challenge existing power structures. Interesting. How does that differ from populism on the right?
Right-wing populism often focuses on issues like national identity, immigration, and traditional values. A prime example is Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary. He's emphasized national sovereignty, implemented strict anti-immigration policies, and promoted a conservative Christian worldview. His rhetoric often taps into anxieties about cultural change, economic insecurity, and a perceived threat to national identity.
So on the left, Populism is about rallying the masses against economic inequality and elite capture, while on the right, it's more about appealing to those who feel threatened by globalization, immigration, and social change.
That's a good way to summarize it. But even within these broad categories, there's a lot of variation and nuance. Populism is a complex phenomenon that defies easy categorization.
It seems like every time we try to pin down a political concept, it slips through our fingers and morphs into something new. Okay, what other political label are we going to unpack today?
Let's talk about something that often sparks heated debates: the role of religious influence in politics.
Ooh, that's a touchy subject. But I'm guessing it's one where the lines between left and right aren't as clear as they might seem at first glance.
You are absolutely right. While we often associate religious influence in politics with the right, particularly in countries like the US, it's a phenomenon that can manifest in surprising ways.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me some examples of how religious influence plays out on the left.
Let's start with Nicaragua. President Daniel Ortega, a former revolutionary and leader of the left-wing Sandinista National Liberation Front, has increasingly incorporated religious rhetoric into his political strategy. He's aligned himself with conservative religious groups and even positioned himself as a defender of traditional Catholic values.
That's surprising. A former Marxist revolutionary embracing religious rhetoric. What's the motivation there?
It's all about consolidating power and appealing to a broad base of support. In a predominantly Catholic country like Nicaragua, aligning with the church can be a powerful way to solidify one's political legitimacy.
So it's a case of pragmatism over ideology, even in the realm of religion and politics. Fascinating. Any other unexpected examples from the left?
Well, let's not forget Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. They both used Christian symbolism and rhetoric to connect with the largely Christian population, presenting their socialist agenda as aligned with Christian values.
Wow. Using the imagery and language of Christianity to bolster a socialist movement. That's quite a strategy. Okay, but now I need some context for the more traditional right-wing use of religious influence. What are some examples of that?
Well, the U.S. Republican Party provides a classic example. Evangelical Christian values have become deeply intertwined with their platform, shaping their stances on issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, and education. Their appeal to religious voters is a key part of their electoral strategy.
Right, the religious right is a powerful force in American politics.
Yeah.
Any other examples from around the world?
Poland's Law and Justice Party is another interesting case. They've incorporated Catholic values into their platform, advocating for traditional family structures, anti-abortion policies, and policies against LGBTQ+ rights. Their alignment with the Catholic Church, a powerful institution in Poland, resonates with a significant portion of the electorate.
So whether it's promoting family values or aligning with traditional religious doctrines, the right often leverages religious influence to mobilize voters and shape social policy.
It's a powerful force in politics, both domestically and internationally.
This has been an absolutely mind-blowing journey so far. We've explored so many different policies and seen how they can take on such different meanings depending on the cultural and political context.
And we're not finished yet. There's still so much more to discover about this global kaleidoscope of political ideologies.
I can't wait. This is like a crash course in political relativity. What's next on our agenda?
Let's shift gears and talk about something a bit more personal. The idea of left and right values. What do we really mean when we use those terms, and how do those values translate into concrete policies?
Okay, I'm ready for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Let's unpack those values.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From nationalism and protectionism to the welfare state and religious influence in politics.
It's been quite a journey, exploring how these seemingly straightforward political labels, left and right, can mean such different things depending on where you are in the world.
Like what's considered progressive in one country can be totally mainstream in another, or even conservative. Right, and what's seen as radical in one place might be completely normal somewhere else.
It's like we need a whole new compass to navigate the political landscape.
I think the key takeaway here is that the world is far more complex than we often give it credit for.
It's so easy to fall into those oversimplifications, like trying to fit these complex ideologies into neat little boxes.
Exactly. But the reality is those boxes just don't hold up when you start looking at the nuances of global politics.
And that brings us to a really important question. How do we even talk about politics in a meaningful way when those labels can be so slippery?
It's a challenge, for sure, But I think it starts with recognizing our own biases.
Our biases.
Yes, our own perspectives are always shaped by our own experiences, our own cultures, our own values.
So we need to be aware of those blind spots.
Exactly. We need to acknowledge that what seems like common sense to us might not be so common in other parts of the world.
So it's about being open to different ways of seeing things.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that there are multiple valid perspectives on these complex political issues.
It's like that old saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
Right. But in this case, it's see the world through someone else's political lens. Try to understand where they're coming from.
Because if we're not careful, those labels, left and right, they can become weapons, used to shut down conversation rather than open it up.
Exactly. It's so easy to dismiss someone who has a different political view, to label them as wrong or crazy.
But that just leads to more division, doesn't it?
It does. And it prevents us from finding common ground, from working together to solve the challenges we face.
So how do we move beyond those labels and have more productive conversations?
I think it starts with curiosity. Instead of dismissing someone who disagrees with us, we should be asking questions, trying to understand their point of view,
Even if we ultimately disagree.
especially if we disagree. Because that's where real learning happens, when we're challenged to think critically about our own beliefs.
So it's about being open to changing our minds.
It's about being willing to be wrong, which can be hard, I know, but it's essential if we want to grow and evolve.
It's like that saying, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Exactly. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know.
And that humility can open us up to new perspectives.
It can. It allows us to see the world with fresh eyes and to appreciate the complexity and diversity of human thought.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. It's really made me think about how I view the world.
Me too, and I hope it's done the same for our listeners.
Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together, right? Trying to make sense of this complex world.
We are, and the more we understand each other's perspectives, the better equipped we'll be to face those challenges together.
So let's keep those conversations going, folks. Challenge your assumptions. Be curious. And remember, the world is a lot more nuanced than those simple labels might suggest.
Well said.
And that's a wrap on today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this whirlwind tour of global political ideologies. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the world beyond our borders.